For most of the Kremlin's war on Ukraine, Russia's vast size has been one of its greatest strengths. Its military factories are spread across the country. Its territory, the largest in the world, stretches across several time zones. And for a long time, that huge scale made it difficult to strike at the heart of Russia's war machine. But what if that's starting to change?
What used to be their huge advantage, they have huge millions of square kilometers of territory and everything's very spread out, is actually now turning into a disadvantage.
That's DW's Kyiv correspondent Nick Connolly, and that insight helps explain some of the most important developments we're seeing in the war today, like long-range Ukrainian drone attacks deep inside Russian territory and growing pressure on critical supply routes. Russia may have vast resources, but it can't defend everything, everywhere, all at once. So is Ukraine successfully exploiting one of Moscow's biggest vulnerabilities? And could that change the course of the war?
Ukraine didn't have a choice, right? It's not like they had cruise missiles or ballistic missiles they could have used instead. Basically, from early in 2024, you saw the first long-range attacks on Russian oil facilities. The damage wasn't, for the most part, really long kind of lasting. That really has changed because they're getting a lot more precise. The Russians are still going to shoot down probably 70-80% of the drones. But if Ukraine is cranking out enough to send hundreds and maybe soon thousands of those drones every night, then enough of them will get through to make a real difference.
In other words, Ukraine isn't relying on a miracle weapon. The strategy is to stretch Russian defences by forcing Moscow to protect an ever-growing number of targets spread across an enormous country. And nowhere is that strategy more visible than in Crimea. For years, the peninsula has been one of Russia's most important military assets, but now Ukraine appears focused on making it more difficult and more costly for Moscow to hold on to it.
Before the full-scale invasion and even the first few years of this war, military experts here in Kyiv would describe Crimea as kind of a Russian aircraft carrier docked off the coast of Ukraine. It was covered in Russian military installations, missile bases, obviously the Black Sea Fleet, all kinds of logistics also for Russian troops fighting in southern mainland Ukraine. And there was a real sense, and still is, that is a very direct threat. Lots of the drones that hit central southern Ukraine are launched in Crimea. Lots of the ballistic missiles also come from there. This is part of Vladimir Putin's story for Russians, that he's bringing back all these territories. He's gathering the Russian lands as he claims they are. And obviously, if he were to lose Crimea or not even be able to provide kind of the basics of life in Crimea, that is politically really difficult for him.
All right, so Crimea isn't just strategically important, it's politically important too. To increase the pressure on Russia, Ukraine is increasingly targeting the routes and infrastructure that keep the peninsula supplied.
And now what's happened the last couple of months, we've seen Ukraine moving to the north. So basically the connections between Crimea and occupied Ukraine, that's the land route where most of the logistics and the kind of supplies were coming in. So if you just look at a map, you'd look at kind of Rostov, which is in kind of southwestern Russia, and they would go past Mariupol along the North Sea of the Sea of Azov down into Crimea. We've seen attacks on the bridges there. We've seen basically Ukraine set up drone control over the routes going into Crimea along the kind of north coast of the Sea of Azov.
And according to Nick, the result is that supplying Crimea is becoming increasingly difficult.
If you go onto Telegram in Russian Ukrainian, you will see endless videos of burnt out trucks and cars west of Mariupol trying to get to Crimea. So that's just a routine thing. We're not talking about deep strikes here. These are middle or even kind of not even quite middle strikes now. That is just routine. And we've seen examples of pictures on social media doing the rounds of what Ukraine claims are fuel trucks trying to get to Crimea, pretending to be taking food. So kind of dressed up as kind of a milk truck, but actually was carrying fuel to try and avoid drone strikes. Are these drones, that's the kind of question, are they now enabling Ukraine to make it impossible to hold on to this territory without having men in trenches losing their lives, taking each other out, right? So that's the kind of question, whether these attacks on Russia's logistics, the lockdown, often people here in Ukraine call it like a lockdown, basically mean that at some point the Russians have to turn around themselves because they're just left without any fuel and without any ammunition.
Now, the bigger question is whether Ukraine can expand this strategy, not by recapturing territory quickly, but instead by making the war more costly for Russia to sustain. And according to Nick, that shift may have already happened.
I think we're already there, definitely. I mean, we haven't seen a big Ukrainian attempt at that kind of counteroffensive since 2023. Obviously, since then, we've seen smaller, localized kind of attacks, but it's never been that kind of, oh, let's gather up dozens of tanks and lots of people on foot or in armored vehicles and see how it goes. 2023 was not a success. Off camera, lots of people here will tell you, and some on camera, that also wasn't their idea, that was basically America and the West telling them to do that they wanted to keep on going in 2022, and while they were on a roll, while they were taking territory back, just roll the Russians back. But basically the West got scared of Vladimir Putin's nuclear threats and basically told the Ukrainians to hold off for the big counteroffensive the next summer, which then turned into a flop.
And the lesson many in Ukraine took from that experience was that another major counteroffensive simply wasn't worth the cost. Instead, the focus shifted towards attrition, making the war steadily more expensive for Russia in both manpower and resources.
Soon the Russians really are going to start running out of people, right? They've obviously been recruiting a lot of people, but the kind of reservoir of people who are willing to sign up for cash is now, largely exhausted. And if also the news is that bad and people, end up surviving only a couple of weeks or months on the front lines, that's going to make it even harder to recruit. So there is a sense that, just try and reduce the losses on the battlefield, slow the Russians down as much as possible, and maybe, they might take a town or two more.
But there's a catch. While Ukraine is betting that deep strikes, logistics pressure, and attrition can weaken Russia over time, Russia is still able to inflict enormous damage on Ukrainian cities, and it did exactly that on the night of July 5th, hitting Kyiv with a massive barrage, as Nick told us about one day later.
I think what really changed from Ukraine's perspective is that we had 0 intercepts last night, 0 ballistic intercepts, as we said. Cruise missiles, drones were still 90% plus intercepted as per usual, but with ballistic and hypersonic missiles, which are basically the same in terms of interception, you've only got the Patriot system, and as we've heard from Zelensky, very low stocks of those interceptors still here in the country, and that is a new quality. Even last week, they intercepted a handful of missiles of about just short of 30 that came this way. Last night, 0. If you look back to kind of end of May, you would have had maybe around kind of 50-60%, sometimes even 2/3 being intercepted. So that is a very big deal and a huge kind of change.
For Ukraine, that's the dilemma. Kyiv is trying to use Russia's size against it, stretching its air defences and driving up the cost of the war. But Russia can still inflict enormous damage on Ukrainian cities. That's the paradox. Ukraine can't protect everything. Increasingly, neither can Russia.
And we've seen real damage. So just one example, Votkinsk, which is basically kind of northeastern European Russia. That's where lots of the ballistic missiles that hit Kyiv last night are put together. And in February, we had a Ukrainian strike, drones and cruise drones, as they're called, so basically slightly faster drones together, put a hole that was 20 meters wide into the ceiling of the facility where they put these missiles together. This is a facility where everything has to be fully hygienic, right? You can't have a speck of dust in there, otherwise some of the electronics can go wrong. And suddenly there's a giant hole in the ceiling of this plant, the elements coming in. That is not something that you can repair on the quick. So I think, this is really something that Russia, in its hubris, probably just didn't prepare for and is now paying the price of that kind of overconfidence.
Russia's vast territory has long been one of its greatest strategic strengths, but as Ukraine expands its drone campaign, targets logistics and strikes military infrastructure deep inside Russia, that same geography may be becoming an increasingly difficult vulnerability for Moscow to defend. Whether that is enough to alter the course of the war is unclear. I'm Pablo Folilias. Thanks for watching. See you next time.